The iron bars were rusted from mountain rain, but they held strong as ever. Thomas Blackwood pressed his massive frame against the cold metal, watching the townspeople of Pine Ridge gather in the square below. They came every Sunday after church, drawn by curiosity and fear in equal measure. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts while pointing at the wooden platform where his cage sat like a grotesque monument to civilization's triumph over the wild. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Look at the beast. Someone whispered loud enough for him to hear. 7 feet tall and wild as the wolves that raised him. Thomas said nothing. Words had abandoned him long ago, somewhere between the trap that had caught him and the months of captivity that followed. The people of Pine Ridge had found him living alone in the mountain caves, surviving on what the wilderness provided. They called him dangerous, a threat to their children and livestock. The truth was simpler and sadder. He was just a man who had forgotten how to live among other people. His story had become legend in the 3 years since his capture. Some said he was raised by bears after his family died in a mountain avalanche. Others claimed he had murdered his own kin and fled to the wilderness to escape justice. The reality, buried beneath layers of fear and folklore, was that Thomas Blackwood had once been a respected lumber foreman until grief and guilt had driven him into the mountains to die. Instead, he had learned to survive. Mayor Harrison stood before the cage now, reading from a yellowed piece of paper, as he did every month. The mountain man known as Thomas Blackwood remains the property of Pine Ridge Township, captured under territorial law for the protection of local citizens. Any person wishing to purchase guardianship may submit a bid of no less than $50 to the town council. The announcement was a formality. No one had ever made a serious offer. Who would want responsibility for a man they believed was more animal than human? Thomas had stopped hoping for freedom long ago. The cage had become his entire world, 10 feet by 12 feet of wooden platform and iron bars. He slept on straw like livestock, ate scraps thrown by curious visitors, and endured the stares of people who saw him as entertainment rather than a human being. But this Sunday was different. Through the crowd of familiar faces, Thomas spotted someone new. A woman in a black dress stood at the edge of the gathering, her dark hair pulled back beneath a simple bonnet. She was perhaps 30 years old, with the bearing of someone accustomed to hardship, but not broken by it. What struck Thomas most was how she looked at him. Not with fear or revulsion, but with something that might have been recognition. Margaret Sullivan had arrived in Pine Ridge 3 days earlier on the morning stage, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and a grief that seemed to weigh more than her slight frame could bear. She had come west seeking work after her husband's death, hoping distance might ease the pain of losing the only person who had ever truly known her. The job at the general store paid little, but it included a small room above the shop and the promise of honest labor. She had heard the stories about the mountain man before she ever saw him. Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house had warned her to stay away from the town square on Sundays. That creature is unpredictable, she had said. With a shudder, 7 feet of muscle and rage, caught stealing chickens from decent folk. They say he howls at the moon and speaks in tongues when the madness takes him. But the man Margaret saw in the cage bore little resemblance to the monster of local legend. Yes, he was uncommonly large, with shoulders that spoke of years spent, swinging an axe and arms that could probably snap a man in half. His dark hair and beard had grown wild during his captivity, and his clothes were little more than rags. Yet there was something in his eyes that reminded Margaret of her late husband during his darkest moments. Not madness or violence, but deep, abiding sadness that came from losing something precious and irreplaceable. Margaret found herself returning to the square over the following days, not for the spectacle like the others, but to observe the man they kept like a circus animal. She noticed things the townspeople had missed or chosen to ignore. The way Thomas carefully arranged the straw in his cage each morning, creating a neat sleeping area despite his captive conditions. How he saved portions of his meager food to feed the sparrows that landed on his platform. The gentle way he moved his massive hands when children came too close, ensuring he never accidentally frightened them more than his presence already did. Most telling of all was what happened during the thunderstorms that rolled down from the mountains. While the townspeople hurried indoors, Margaret watched from her window as Thomas stood calmly in his cage, face turned toward the sky as rain soaked through the inadequate roof covering. He wasn't cowering or raging against his imprisonment. He was remembering something that brought him peace. It was during one of these observations that Margaret made her decision. She had been in Pine Ridge for nearly 2 weeks, working long hours at Patterson's general store and trying to build a new life from the fragments of her old one. The work was honest but lonely, and the townspeople treated her with the polite distance reserved for outsiders. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had money saved from selling her husband's tools and their small farm back east. Not much, but enough to survive until she could establish herself. The idea came to her gradually, then all at once with startling clarity. The town wanted $50 for guardianship of Thomas Blackwood. She had $67 hidden in her room, the last remnant of a life she had lost. But more than money, she had something else that might serve as payment. Around her neck, on a thin gold chain, hung her wedding ring. Her husband David had worked extra shifts at the mill for 3 months to afford it, presenting it to her on their wedding day with hands that shook from nervousness and pride. After David's death from pneumonia the previous winter, Margaret had moved the ring from her finger to the chain, unable to bear its weight on her hand but unwilling to remove it entirely. It was all she had left of the man who had seen past her quiet nature to the strength beneath, who had believed she was capable of more than the world expected from a poor farmer's daughter. Now standing in her small room above the general store, Margaret held the ring up to the lamplight and made a choice that would have shocked anyone who thought they knew her. She was going to offer it as partial payment for Thomas Blackwood's freedom. Not because she believed the stories about his supernatural strength or wilderness skills, but because she recognized in him the same bone-deep loneliness that had been eating away at her since David's death. The next morning, Margaret walked to the town hall with her wedding ring wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth and her remaining money counted out to the penny. Mayor Harrison looked up from his ledger with the expression of a man interrupted during important work, his thin mustache twitching with impatience. "Miss Sullivan, isn't it? How can the town council assist you today?" Margaret placed the cloth bundle on his desk with hands that trembled only slightly. "I want to purchase guardianship of the mountain man. I have $52 in cash and this ring to make up the difference." Mayor Harrison stared at her as if she had announced her intention to sprout wings and fly to the moon. He was a small, precise man who took pride in maintaining order in Pine Ridge, and Margaret's request represented the kind of chaos he spent his life trying to prevent. "Miss Sullivan, I'm not sure you understand what you're proposing. That man is dangerous. He was captured after terrorizing homesteaders for months, stealing livestock and threatening honest citizens. The cage isn't just for show, it's for public safety." Margaret had prepared for this response. Over the past week, she had made discreet inquiries about Thomas Blackwood's actual crimes. The truth was far less dramatic than the story suggested. He had been found living in a cave system 20 miles outside town, subsisting on wild game and whatever he could forage. The livestock theft consisted of taking eggs from a chicken coop and a single pig that had wandered too far from its pen. No violence had been involved, and no threats had been made. Thomas had been captured while sleeping, weakened by hunger and an infected wound on his leg. Mayor Harrison, I've reviewed the official records. Mr. Blackwood was charged with petty theft, not assault or murder. Under territorial law, I have the right to assume guardianship responsibility for any prisoner whose crimes fall below the felony threshold. This was not entirely accurate, but Margaret had learned that confident assertions often carried more weight than absolute truth. She had spent hours in the town hall's small library, reading through dusty legal texts and territorial statutes until she found language that could be interpreted to support her position. Mayor Harrison opened the cloth bundle and examined the wedding ring with the calculating eye of a man who understood the value of gold. It was a simple band, but well made and clearly worth more than the $8 needed to reach the $50 threshold. Even if this were legally permissible, Miss Sullivan, what would you do with him? The man hasn't spoken a coherent word in 3 years. He's been living like an animal for so long that he may not remember how to exist in civilized society. That's my concern to manage, Margaret replied with more confidence than she felt. I'm requesting formal guardianship transfer. I have the required payment and accept full legal responsibility for his actions. What Margaret didn't tell Mayor Harrison was that she had already secured employment for both herself and Thomas, should her plan succeed. Robert Chun, who owned the largest lumber operation in the valley, had been struggling with a shortage of experienced workers. When Margaret had mentioned that she might know someone with forestry experience, Chun had expressed guarded interest. He was practical enough to care more about a man's ability to work than his reputation, especially if that work came at a reduced wage. Mayor Harrison spent the better part of an hour trying to talk Margaret out of her decision. He painted vivid pictures of the danger she would face, the social ostracism that would follow, and the legal complications that might arise. But Margaret had made her choice with the same quiet determination that had carried her through her husband's illness and death. She wasn't acting out of romantic foolishness or misguided charity. She was making a calculated decision based on her observation that Thomas Blackwood was not the monster the town believed him to be. Finally, faced with Margaret's unwavering resolve and the legal precedent she had discovered, Mayor Harrison agreed to present her request to the town council. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon, giving Margaret 24 hours to either come to her senses or prepare for the consequences of her decision. That evening, Margaret stood in the town square after most of the curious onlookers had departed. Thomas sat in his cage as he always did, massive frame somehow diminished by the iron bars that contained him. For the first time since she had arrived in Pine Ridge, Margaret approached close enough to speak. "My name is Margaret Sullivan," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying the 10 feet between them. "I've submitted a request to the town council for your guardianship transfer." Thomas looked up at her with eyes that were startlingly blue in his weathered face. He said nothing, but Margaret saw something shift in his expression. Not hope, exactly, but a flicker of interest that suggested he was still capable of caring about his fate. "I don't know what brought you to these mountains or why you chose to live alone," Margaret continued, "but I know what it's like to lose everything and have to start over. If the council approves my request, I'm offering you a chance to do that. Work, a place to stay, and the opportunity to decide for yourself what kind of life you want to build." Thomas remained silent, but his attention was completely focused on Margaret now. She could see intelligence in his gaze, along with a wariness that spoke of too many disappointments to risk believing in rescue. "I'm not asking you to trust me," Margaret said. "I'm just asking you to consider that maybe there's still something worth living for outside these bars." She left him then, walking back to her small room with her heart hammering against her ribs. The die was cast, and by tomorrow evening she would either be responsible for a man she barely knew or facing the humiliation of public rejection by the town council. But as Margaret prepared for bed that night, she felt something she hadn't experienced since David's death: purpose, For the first time in months, she was moving toward something instead of just away from grief. Whether that something would prove to be salvation or disaster remained to be seen, but at least she was no longer simply existing from one day to the next. In his cage, Thomas Blackwood lay on his bed of straw and stared up at the stars visible through the iron bars above his head. A woman had spoken to him as if he were human. She had offered him something he had stopped dreaming about during the long months of captivity: choice. He didn't know if he could trust her offer or if he even remembered how to live outside a cage, but for the first time in 3 years, Thomas allowed himself to imagine that tomorrow might be different from today. The town council meeting convened at 2 o'clock the following afternoon in the cramped back room of the town hall. Margaret sat on a wooden bench facing 5 men who looked at her with expressions ranging from puzzlement to outright hostility. Mayor Harrison had clearly spent the morning lobbying against her request, painting her as either naive or dangerous in her intentions. Councilman Roberts, a heavy-set man who owned the largest ranch in the area, spoke first. "Miss Sullivan, we appreciate your humanitarian instincts, but you must understand our position. That man has been contained for 3 years for the safety of our community. Releasing him into your custody would create liability issues that extend far beyond your personal welfare." Margaret had anticipated this argument and prepared accordingly. "Gentlemen, I'm not requesting his release into the general population. I'm requesting transfer of legal guardianship, which makes me fully responsible for his actions and whereabouts. Under my proposal, Mr. Blackwood would be employed at Chun's lumber operation, supervised during working hours, and residing in accommodations I would provide. He would have no more freedom than any other employee, just better living conditions than a cage." Councilman Davis, the town's only lawyer, leaned forward with interest. "You mentioned employment. Has Mr. Chun agreed to hire a man with no verifiable work history and a reputation for violent behavior?" This was the weakness in Margaret's plan, the point where confidence met the harsh reality of practical arrangements. She had spoken with Robert Chun, but he had made no firm commitments, beyond expressing willingness to consider an experienced worker if proper supervision could be guaranteed. "Mr. Chun has indicated interest in evaluating Mr. Blackwood's capabilities," Margaret said carefully. "The lumber industry requires physical strength and familiarity with forest conditions. Mr. Blackwood's years of mountain survival suggest he possesses both qualities." What she didn't mention was that Chun's interest was primarily financial. Experienced loggers commanded high wages, while a man under legal guardianship could be employed at whatever rate his guardian negotiated. It wasn't exploitation if it provided Thomas with honest work and the opportunity to prove himself. But Margaret knew the council would view such arrangements with suspicion. The debate continued for nearly an hour, with various council members raising objections about public safety, legal precedent, and Margaret's qualifications to supervise a man they considered dangerous. Through it all, Margaret maintained her composed demeanor while internally cataloging every argument for future reference. She was learning valuable lessons about small-town politics and the power of perception to override fact. Finally, Mayor Harrison called for a vote. All in favor of approving Miss Sullivan's guardianship request? 2 hands rose tentatively. Davis and a younger councilman named Peters, who had remained quiet throughout the proceedings. Opposed? 3 hands shot up immediately, including Mayor Harrison's own. Margaret felt her heart sink as her carefully constructed plan crumbled. She had been so focused on the legal and practical aspects of her proposal that she had underestimated the emotional resistance to any change in Thomas's status. To the council members, he represented a solved problem. His cage was proof of their effectiveness in protecting the community, and his continued containment validated their original decision to capture him. But as the meeting began to adjourn, Councilman Peters spoke up unexpectedly. "I'd like to propose a compromise." Mayor Harrison paused in gathering his papers, clearly annoyed by this development. What sort of compromise, Peters? A probationary period. 30 days of supervised guardianship with weekly reports to the council. If Mr. Blackwood demonstrates that he can function safely in a work environment, we make the arrangement permanent. If there are any incidents, he returns to containment immediately. The proposal caught everyone off guard, including Margaret. It wasn't what she had hoped for, but it represented a possibility where none had existed moments before. She watched the council members consider this middle ground, seeing the appeal of an approach that appeared both humanitarian and cautious. Davis nodded slowly. That's actually quite reasonable. It allows us to evaluate the situation without making an irrevocable commitment. Mayor Harrison was less enthusiastic, but he recognized the political wisdom of compromise when 3 members of his 5-person council seemed inclined to support it. Miss Sullivan, would you accept guardianship under these conditions? Margaret didn't hesitate. Yes, absolutely. Very well. All in favor of a 30-day probationary guardianship arrangement. This time, 4 hands rose. Only Councilman Roberts maintained his opposition, shaking his head as if the entire proceeding represented civilization's surrender to chaos. As Margaret walked out of the town hall with a signed guardianship transfer in her hands, she felt a mixture of triumph and terror that left her slightly dizzy. She had won, but victory came with responsibilities she wasn't entirely sure she could handle. In 30 days, she would have to prove that Thomas Blackwood could live peacefully among the people who had caged him for 3 years. More challenging still, she would have to help him remember how to be human after years of being treated like an animal. The sun was setting behind the mountains as Margaret approached Thomas's cage for the second time. He was sitting with his back against the iron bars, watching the last townspeople depart from the square. When he saw her coming, something in his posture suggested he already knew what she was going to tell him. The council approved a probationary guardianship, Margaret said without preamble. 30 days to prove you can work and live peacefully. If there are any problems, you return to the cage immediately. Thomas studied her face for a long moment before speaking. His voice, when it came, was rusty from disuse, but surprisingly gentle for such a large man. Why would you do this for? A stranger? It was the first time Margaret had heard him speak, and the simple question carried weight far beyond its few words. She had asked herself the same thing repeatedly over the past few days, and the answer was both complex and startlingly simple. Because everyone deserves a second chance, she said. And because I think there's more to your story than people know. Thomas was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if he would respond at all. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight of sorrow that made her heart ache. I'm not the man I used to be. 3 years in a cage changes you in ways that can't be undone. You might be making a mistake that costs both of us everything. Margaret recognized the warning for what it was, an attempt to protect her from the consequences of her own compassion. But she had made her decision with full awareness of the risks involved. Maybe I am making a mistake, she admitted. But it's my mistake to make. The question is whether you're willing to try. Thomas looked up at the stars beginning to appear. In the darkening sky, then back at Margaret's determined face. After 3 years of captivity, the prospect of freedom was both thrilling and terrifying. He had grown accustomed to the simplicity of cage life, where his only concerns were survival and endurance. The outside world represented complexity, responsibility, and the constant possibility of failure. But it also represented choice, dignity, and the chance to discover if any part of the man he used to be still existed beneath the layers of grief and guilt that had driven him into the mountains. When do we start? Thomas asked quietly. Margaret smiled for the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge. Tomorrow morning. The council wants you to begin work immediately to demonstrate your commitment to the arrangement. As she walked back to her room that night, Margaret realized she had crossed a line from which there was no return. Tomorrow. She would be responsible for a man whose past was largely unknown and whose future depended entirely on their ability to trust each other. It was a daunting prospect, but also an oddly exhilarating one. For the first time since David's death, Margaret Sullivan was no longer just surviving. She was building something new, something that required both courage and faith in equal measure. Whether that something would prove to be redemption or disaster remained to be seen, but at least she was no longer simply marking time until her own life resumed meaning. In his cage, Thomas Blackwood prepared for his last night of captivity, with a mixture of anticipation and dread that he hadn't felt since the day they brought him down from the mountains. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of either his return to humanity or the final proof that some things, once broken, could never be repaired. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Thomas allowed himself to hope that the woman who had purchased his freedom with her wedding ring might know something about healing that he had forgotten during his long exile from the world of living people. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and possibility through the iron bars of his cage, reminding Thomas of mornings when he had been free to choose his own path through the wilderness. Tomorrow, if Margaret Sullivan was right about second, chances he might have the opportunity to choose again. And this time, perhaps he would choose to walk towards something instead of away from everything he had lost. Dawn broke cold and gray over Pine Ridge as Margaret made her way to the town square, carrying a bundle of clean clothes and a bowl of warm porridge she had prepared in her small kitchen. The early morning streets were empty except for a few merchants opening their shops, and she was grateful for the relative privacy. Today would be difficult enough without curious onlookers documenting every moment of Thomas's transition from captivity to conditional freedom. She found him sitting exactly as she had left him the night before, but something had changed in his bearing. The resignation that had marked his posture for 3 years had been replaced by a tense alertness, as if his body was remembering what it meant to prepare for action. When he saw her approaching, Thomas stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding from the cramped confines of the cage with careful deliberation. "Good morning," Margaret said, setting down her bundle and producing a large iron key that Mayor Harrison had reluctantly provided. "I brought breakfast and some clothes that might fit better than what you're wearing." Thomas looked down at the threadbare remnants of his shirt and pants, garments that had been adequate 3 years ago, but now barely served to maintain his modesty. The clothes Margaret offered were simple but clean, work pants and a flannel shirt that had belonged to her late husband. She had purchased them from the general store using her employee discount, guessing at sizes based on her observation of Thomas's build. "They belonged to my husband," Margaret said as she unlocked the cage door. "He was smaller than you, but they should serve until we can arrange for proper fittings." The iron door swung open with a harsh squeal that seemed to echo through the empty square. Thomas stared at the opening for several seconds, as if his mind couldn't quite process that the barrier between him and the world had actually been removed. Margaret stepped back to give him space, understanding that this moment required dignity rather than assistance. Thomas emerged from the cage slowly, testing each step as if he expected the ground to give way beneath his feet. When he stood fully upright in the open air, Margaret realized she had underestimated his size. The cage had compressed his presence, making him seem smaller and less formidable than he actually was. Now standing free in the morning light, Thomas Blackwood was an imposing figure indeed. "How does it feel?" Margaret asked quietly. Thomas took a deep breath, filling his lungs with air that hadn't been filtered through iron bars. "Strange," he admitted. "I'd forgotten how much space the world actually contains." Margaret handed him the bundle of clothes and gestured toward a small building at the edge of the square. "You can change in the tool shed behind the blacksmith's shop. I'll wait here with breakfast." As Thomas walked away, Margaret noticed how he moved with the careful awareness of a man accustomed to navigating dangerous terrain. His steps were silent despite his size, and his eyes constantly scanned the environment around him. These were not the movements of a madman or a brute, but of someone who had spent years surviving in conditions that would have killed most people. When Thomas returned wearing David's clothes, the transformation was remarkable. The garments were indeed tight across his shoulders and short in the arms, but they restored a measure of human dignity that the cage had stripped away. More importantly, they allowed Margaret to see past the wild beard and unkempt hair to the man beneath. Thomas Blackwood had once been handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and intelligent eyes that spoke of education and refinement. "Better," Margaret said, offering him the bowl of porridge. "Much better." Thomas accepted the food with hands that trembled slightly, whether from hunger or emotion Margaret couldn't tell. He ate slowly, savoring each bite as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. Margaret found herself studying his face, noting the way he closed his eyes when the warm food hit his tongue, and the careful way he held the bowl, as if it were made of finest china. "The lumber camp is about 2 miles north of town," Margaret said as Thomas finished eating. "Mr. Chun wants to evaluate your capabilities before making any commitments, but he's agreed to give you a fair trial." Thomas nodded, setting down the empty bowl with the same careful precision he had used while eating. "What did you tell him about me?" "The truth, mostly. That you have experience with forestry work and that you've been living independently for several years. I may have omitted some details about the circumstances of your capture." A ghost of a smile crossed Thomas's weathered features. "Diplomatic of you. Practical," Margaret corrected. "Mr. Chun cares more about results than reputation, but even practical men have limits to their tolerance for controversy." They began walking north through the awakening town, and Margaret was acutely aware of the attention their passage attracted. Shopkeepers paused in sweeping their storefronts to stare openly at the freed mountain man. Women gathering water from the town well whispered behind their hands, while their children peered around their skirts with wide eyes. A group of men outside the saloon stopped their conversation entirely to watch Thomas pass, their hands moving instinctively toward the weapons they carried. Thomas seemed oblivious to the scrutiny, his attention focused on the simple act of walking freely through open spaces. Margaret realized that for him, the sensation of unrestricted movement was probably overwhelming after 3 years of confinement. Every step took him further from the cage that had defined his existence, but also deeper into a world that viewed him with suspicion and fear. "They're afraid of you," Margaret observed as they left the main street behind. "They should be," Thomas replied without emotion. "Fear keeps people alive in dangerous situations." "I am dangerous, Miss Sullivan. Not in the way they imagine, but dangerous nonetheless." Margaret glanced at him sharply. "Are you trying to warn me away from helping you?" Thomas was quiet for several steps before answering. "I'm trying to be honest about what you've taken responsibility for. The man I was before I went into the mountains died up there, along with everything else I cared about. What came back down isn't the same person. What happened to him?" "The man you were before?" Thomas stopped walking and turned to face Margaret. Directly, in the morning light, she could see the full extent of the damage that time and grief had inflicted on him. His face was deeply lined despite his relative youth, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had stared too long into an abyss of his own making. "He made a mistake that cost other people their lives," Thomas said simply. "And when he couldn't live with the guilt, he ran away into the wilderness to die. But dying proved harder than expected, so he learned to survive instead. Year after year, season after season, until surviving was all he remembered how to do." Margaret absorbed this confession, understanding that Thomas was offering her a chance to reconsider her commitment before they went any further. He was giving her the truth about his past, or at least part of it, and allowing her to judge whether the risk was worth taking. "Everyone makes mistakes," Margaret said finally. "The measure of a person isn't whether they stumble, but whether They're willing to get back up and try to do better. And if the mistake was so terrible that getting back up feels like a betrayal of the people who died because of it? Margaret considered this question seriously, recognizing the philosophical weight behind it. Then maybe the betrayal is in staying down. Maybe the people who died deserve to have their deaths mean something, and the only way to honor them is to keep living and trying to prevent similar tragedies. Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and Margaret had the impression that her words had reached something deep inside him that had been buried under years of self-recrimination. He didn't respond verbally, but when they resumed walking, there was something different in his posture, as if a small portion of the weight he carried had been lifted. The lumber camp sprawled across a natural clearing where the mountain forest met the valley floor. Massive pine logs lay stacked in neat rows, waiting to be processed by the steam-powered saw that dominated the center of the operation. Men with axes and crosscut saws worked in pairs to fell the giant trees that would eventually become the lumber that built homes and businesses throughout the territory. The air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut wood and the sound of human labor applied to the ancient task of harvesting the forest. Robert Chun emerged from a small office building as Margaret and Thomas approached. He was a compact man in his 50s, with the weathered hands and keen eyes of someone who had spent his life working with wood. His family had immigrated from China 20 years earlier, and he had built his lumber business through a combination of hard work, fair dealing, and an intuitive understanding of forest management that impressed even his competitors. "Miss Sullivan," Chun said with a polite nod. "And this must be Mr. Blackwood." Thomas extended his hand, and Margaret watched Chun's reaction as he took in the mountain man's imposing size and obvious strength. To his credit, Chun showed no fear or revulsion, merely the calculating assessment of a businessman evaluating a potential asset. "Mr. Chun," Thomas said simply, "thank you for considering my employment. I understand you have experience with forestry work," Chun replied, leading them toward a section of forest where his crew was preparing to fell a particularly large pine. "Can you tell me about your background?" Thomas glanced at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. They had discussed this conversation during their walk, agreeing that honesty would serve better than deception in the long run. "I was a foreman for Mountain View Logging Company for 8 years before I left civilization," Thomas said. "I supervised crews of 12 to 15 men, planned cutting operations, and managed timber transport. I'm familiar with all aspects of lumber production from tree selection to mill processing." Chun raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised by the extent of Thomas's experience. "Mountain View was a reputable operation. Why did you leave?" "Personal reasons," Thomas replied. "I needed time away from people and responsibility." It was a careful answer that revealed nothing while implying everything. Chun seemed to understand that pressing for details would be unproductive, so he shifted focus to more practical matters. "Show me how you would approach felling that tree," Chun said, pointing to a massive pine that stood slightly apart from its neighbors. Thomas studied the tree for several minutes, walking around its base and examining the surrounding terrain. Margaret watched him work, noting how his entire demeanor changed as he engaged with familiar tasks. The wariness and uncertainty that had marked his interactions with people disappeared, replaced by the confident assessment of a man who understood his craft. "Wind direction is from the southwest," Thomas said finally. "Ground slopes down toward the east, which is where the tree wants to fall naturally. I'd make my notch cut on the east side, about 18 inches deep and angled at 30 degrees. Back cut would be 2 inches higher than the base of the notch, leaving enough hinge wood to control the fall direction, but not so much that the tree hangs up." Chun nodded approvingly. "And if the wind shifted during the operation, abort the cut if possible, or use wedges to force the fall in the desired direction. Never try to finish a dangerous cut just to avoid waste." "Good answer. Safety first, profit second." Too many operators forget that principle and end up with dead workers. Chung led them to his equipment shed, where axes, saws, and other tools hung in neat rows along the walls. He selected a double-bit axe and handed it to Thomas, who tested its weight and balance with the unconscious skill of someone who had wielded such tools for thousands of hours. "Let's see what you can do," Chun said. Thomas approached a section of pine log that had been marked for cutting, hefted the axe, and began to work. The transformation was remarkable. The careful, uncertain movements that had characterized his interactions with people vanished, replaced by the fluid rhythm of a master craftsman. The axe moved in perfect arcs, each blow precisely placed to remove maximum wood with minimum effort. Chips flew in steady streams as Thomas cut a notch that would have satisfied the most demanding foreman. Margaret found herself mesmerized by the display of skill and power. Thomas's massive frame was perfectly suited to the demanding physical labor of logging, but more than that, his movements showed the kind of expertise that came only from years of dedicated practice. This was not a man playing at being a lumberjack, but a professional who had temporarily lost his way. "Enough," Chun said after watching for several minutes. "You clearly know what you're doing." Thomas stepped back from the log, breathing only slightly harder despite the intense exertion. Margaret noticed that some of the tension had left his shoulders, as if the familiar work had reminded him of something important about himself. "I can offer you standard wages for experienced workers," Chun continued. 50 cents a day plus meals. Work starts at dawn and ends at sunset, 6 days a week. Sunday is for rest and equipment maintenance. It was a generous offer, more than Margaret had dared to hope for. Standard wages meant Chun was treating Thomas as a skilled worker rather than a charity case or a supervised probationer. "There is one condition," Chun added, and Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "Miss Sullivan will need to remain on the property during working hours for the first 2 weeks. Call it supervision, call it insurance, but I need someone present who can vouch for your behavior if questions arise." Margaret started to protest that she had her own employment obligations, but Chun raised a hand to forestall her objections. "I've already spoken with Patterson about borrowing you for lumber camp administrative work. You'll receive your regular wages plus a small bonus for the additional responsibility." It was a perfect solution to a problem Margaret hadn't fully considered. Thomas would have meaningful work that utilized his skills. She would be present to provide the supervision the town council required, and both of them would earn enough money to establish a stable living situation. "Acceptable," Thomas said before Margaret could respond. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow morning. Dawn comes early here, so plan to arrive before sunrise." As they walked back toward town, Margaret felt a cautious optimism beginning to build in her chest. The first major hurdle had been cleared successfully. Thomas had demonstrated his competence and value as a worker. Chun had offered fair employment terms, and the arrangement satisfied the council's supervision requirements. But their success at the lumber camp had not gone unnoticed. Word of Thomas's impressive display of skill had already begun to spread among Chun's workers, and by extension into the broader community. Some people would be relieved to learn that the mountain man was not the savage beast of local legend, but others would be disturbed by evidence that he was far more capable and intelligent than they had assumed. Margaret sensed this shift in perception as they passed through town on their way to secure permanent lodging for Thomas. The stares they attracted were different now, more calculating and less openly fearful. People were beginning to reassess what Thomas Blackwood represented, and not all of them would be comfortable with the conclusion that he was simply a man who had made a tragic mistake. They found temporary accommodation at Miller's boarding house, a rambling 2-story building that catered to traveling workers and permanent residents who couldn't afford their own homes. Mrs. Miller was a practical woman who cared more about regular payment than her tenants' reputations, and she agreed to rent Thomas a small room on the ground floor for $2 a week. "Meals are extra," she informed them as she showed Thomas the Spartan but clean room. 50 cents a day for breakfast and dinner, 25 cents for lunch if you're working in town. The room was barely large enough for a bed, a small table, and a chair, but it offered privacy and dignity that the cage had denied for 3 years. Thomas stood in the doorway for several moments, as if he couldn't quite believe that he would be sleeping in a real bed with 4 walls around him instead of iron bars. "It's perfect," he said finally. "Thank you." Margaret left Thomas to settle into his new accommodations and returned to her own room above the general store. She had letters to write, reports to prepare for the town council, and plans to make. For the challenging weeks ahead, the easy part was over. Now came the real test of whether Thomas Blackwood could successfully reintegrate into a society that had every reason to doubt his stability and good intentions. That evening, as Margaret sat at her small desk, composing a progress report for Mayor Harrison, she reflected on the remarkable changes that had occurred in just one day. This morning, Thomas had been a caged curiosity, a living reminder of what happened to men who rejected civilization's constraints. Tonight, he was an employed lumber worker with his own room and the beginnings of a new life. But Margaret was not naive about the challenges that remained. Thomas's demonstration of competence had solved the immediate problem of employment, but it had also raised new questions about his past and his reasons for abandoning the successful career he had clearly once enjoyed. The truth about what had driven him into the mountains would eventually surface, and when it did, Margaret would need to be prepared to defend her decision to help him. More concerning was the subtle shift she had noticed in how some townspeople looked at Thomas after word of his lumber camp performance spread. Fear was being replaced by suspicion, and suspicion could be more dangerous than simple terror. A fearsome beast could be safely contained, but a capable man with unknown motivations represented a more complex threat. Margaret finished her letter to the council and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and complications. But she also felt a satisfaction that had been absent from her life since David's death. She was building something meaningful, something that honored her late husband's belief in second chances and human redemption. In his room at the boarding house, Thomas lay in his first real bed in 3 years and stared at the ceiling above him. The space felt impossibly large after the confines of his cage, and the silence was almost overwhelming. No curious townspeople chattering outside, no bars creating shadows across his face, no constant reminder that he was on display for the entertainment of others. For the first time since his capture, Thomas allowed himself to think beyond simple survival. Margaret Sullivan had given him more than freedom from the cage. She had given him the possibility of rebuilding something from the wreckage of his former life. Whether he was worthy of such a gift remained to be seen, but at least now he had the opportunity to find out. The work at Chun's lumber camp had awakened memories and skills that Thomas had thought were lost forever. For a few hours, he had been able to forget about the guilt and shame that had driven him into exile, focusing instead on the satisfying challenge of matching human skill against the ancient strength of the forest giants. But the respite was temporary. Tomorrow would bring new tests of his ability to function among people who knew his reputation, but not his story. And eventually, someone would ask the right questions or make the correct connections, and the truth about what had happened at Mountain View Logging Company would emerge. Thomas was not sure he was ready for that reckoning, but Margaret's faith in redemption had planted a seed of hope that he had thought was dead and buried. Perhaps the people who had died because of his mistake deserved to have their deaths mean something. Perhaps the way to honor them was not through endless self-punishment, but through the patient work of becoming someone worthy of the second chance he had been given. The mountain wind whispered through the trees outside his window, carrying scents and sounds that reminded Thomas of his years of solitude. But tonight, instead of calling him back to the wilderness, The wind seemed to be saying farewell to the broken man who had fled into the mountains and welcoming the person he might yet become. Thomas closed his eyes and allowed himself to imagine a future beyond mere survival. A future where the skills and knowledge he had accumulated through years of exile might serve some purpose greater than his own continued existence. It was a fragile hope, easily shattered by the harsh realities of small-town politics and human nature, but it was more than he had possessed when the sun rose that morning. Outside, Pine Ridge settled into the quiet rhythms of a mountain town at rest, unaware that the balance of fear and suspicion that had defined its relationship with the mountain man was beginning to shift in ways that would challenge everyone's assumptions about justice, redemption, and the possibility of genuine change. Margaret lay in her bed above the general store, listening to the distant sound of Thomas moving around in his new room several blocks away. She had set events in motion that could not easily be stopped or controlled, and the outcome would depend as much on the town's capacity for growth as on Thomas's ability to prove himself worthy of their trust. But for the first time since David's death, Margaret felt that she was part of something larger than her own grief, something that connected her to the fundamental human desire to see broken things made whole and lost people find their way home. It was dangerous work, this business of redemption, but it was also sacred work, and Margaret was beginning to understand that some risks were worth taking simply because the alternative was spiritual death. The night deepened around Pine Ridge, wrapping the sleeping town in mountain silence, while two people lay awake in separate rooms, each contemplating the uncertain path they had chosen to walk together toward whatever salvation or destruction awaited them in the days ahead. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning in the third week of Thomas's employment at Chun's lumber camp. Margaret had grown comfortable with their daily routine, arriving at dawn to supervise his work and departing at sunset after completing her administrative duties. Thomas had proven himself to be not only competent, but exceptional, increasing the camp's productivity by nearly 20% through his efficient crew organization and innovative cutting techniques. The other workers had gradually overcome their initial wariness, recognizing Thomas's expertise and appreciating his willingness to take on the most dangerous tasks himself rather than delegating them to less experienced men. Chun had quietly informed Margaret that he intended to offer Thomas a permanent foreman position once the probationary period ended, a development that filled her with cautious optimism about their future prospects. But their success had created its own problems. Word of Thomas's remarkable abilities had spread beyond the lumber camp into the broader community, where it was received with a mixture of grudging respect and deepening suspicion. Some townspeople were pleased to learn that their former captive was proving useful rather than dangerous, but others found his competence more troubling than his earlier reputation for wildness. Sheriff William Garrett represented the latter group, a man in his early 50s with the lean build and calculating eyes of someone accustomed to maintaining order through careful attention to potential threats. Garrett had served as Pine Ridge's primary law enforcement officer for nearly a decade. He prided himself on preventing problems before they occurred, and Thomas Blackwood's transformation from caged beast to respected worker struck him as a development requiring immediate investigation. Margaret first became aware of Garrett's interest when she arrived at the lumber camp to find him in deep conversation with Robert Chun near the equipment shed. Both men looked up as she approached, and she noticed the tension in Chun's posture that suggested the discussion had not been entirely friendly. "Miss Sullivan," Garrett said with a polite tip of his hat, "I was just discussing Mr. Blackwood's employment situation with Mr. Chen. Very impressive progress reports I've been hearing." There was something in the sheriff's tone that made Margaret immediately wary. She had learned to recognize the particular brand of skepticism that masked deeper hostility, and Garrett's seemingly casual inquiry carried undertones that suggested trouble ahead. "Thomas has been an exemplary employee," Margaret replied carefully. His work ethic and expertise have exceeded everyone's expectations. Indeed they have, Garrett agreed. In fact, they've exceeded them to such a degree that I've begun to wonder about his background. A man doesn't develop that level of skill living alone in mountain caves. Chun shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between his appreciation for Thomas's work and his recognition that challenging the sheriff's suspicions could create problems for his business. Margaret realized that their carefully constructed arrangement was about to face its first serious test. Thomas was employed in the lumber industry before his period of isolation, Margaret said. His current performance simply reflects his previous experience. Previous experience with which company? Garrett asked. Under what circumstances did he leave that employment? And most importantly, what happened during those years in the mountains that the good people of Pine Ridge have never heard the full story about? The questions hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, carrying implications that Margaret was not prepared to address. She realized with growing alarm that Thomas's very success had drawn attention to gaps in his official story that a more thorough investigation might easily expose. I'm sure Mr. Blackwood would be happy to answer any questions you might have, Margaret said, though she was not sure of any such thing. Perhaps we could arrange a time for you to speak with him directly. Oh, I intend to do exactly that, Garrett replied. In fact, I'm expecting him to visit my office this afternoon for what you might call an interview. Nothing official, you understand. Just a friendly conversation between a peace officer and a concerned citizen about community safety and proper procedures. Margaret felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications of Garrett's request. An interview with the sheriff would inevitably lead to questions about Thomas's past that neither of them was prepared to answer honestly. More dangerously, it would provide Garrett with an opportunity to probe for inconsistencies in their story that could be used to justify more aggressive action. I should accompany him, Margaret said. As his legal guardian, I have the right to be present during any official questioning. Garrett's smile contained no warmth whatsoever. Of course, Miss Sullivan. Your presence would be most welcome. Shall we say 2 o'clock? After the sheriff departed, Chun pulled Margaret aside with obvious concern written across his weathered features. Miss Sullivan, I hope you understand that I have great respect for Mr. Blackwood's abilities and character. But I also have a business to protect and other employees to consider. If Sheriff Garrett discovers something troubling about his background, I understand your position completely, Margaret assured him, though her mind was racing through possible responses to the crisis that was developing. Thomas has done nothing wrong since beginning work here. His past, whatever it might contain, shouldn't overshadow his current conduct and contributions. I agree in principle, Chun said carefully. But principle and practical reality don't always align in small communities. If Garrett decides that Mr. Blackwood represents some kind of threat, my support may not be sufficient to protect either of you from the consequences. Margaret spent the morning completing her administrative duties while wrestling with the problem of how to prepare Thomas for an interrogation that could destroy everything they had built together. When she found him during the lunch break, he was sitting alone beneath a large pine tree, eating the simple meal Mrs. Miller had prepared for him at the boarding house. Sheriff Garrett wants to see you this afternoon, Margaret said without preamble. He's calling it a friendly interview, but his questions suggest he's investigating your background more thoroughly than we anticipated. Thomas looked up from his meal with the calm expression that Margaret had learned usually masked deeper emotions. What kind of questions? About your previous employment, your time in the mountains, and generally anything that might explain how you developed your current level of expertise. Thomas was quiet for several minutes, staring out at the forest that surrounded the lumber camp. Margaret could see him weighing options and considering consequences with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to making decisions that carried life or death implications. There are things about my past that I haven't told you, Thomas said finally. Things that would make your situation much more complicated if they became public knowledge. Margaret felt a chill of apprehension, but also a strange sense of relief. She had always known that Thomas's story contained elements he had not shared, and his willingness to address that reality suggested he trusted her enough to reveal the truth. "Tell me," she said simply. Thomas set down his lunch and turned to face her directly. "My name is Thomas Blackwood, and I was indeed a foreman at Mountain View Logging Company. But I wasn't just any foreman. I was the son of the company owner, being groomed to take over the business when my father retired." Margaret absorbed this revelation, understanding immediately that it changed everything about Thomas's situation. The son of a wealthy lumber baron didn't simply disappear into the mountains without generating extensive search efforts and ongoing investigation. 8 years ago, I made a decision that resulted in the deaths of 6 men, Thomas continued. Good men with families who trusted my judgment and followed my orders into a situation that I should have recognized was too dangerous to attempt. What happened? Thomas's voice grew heavy with the weight of memories he had spent years trying to forget. There was a section of forest on the north slope that everyone knew was unstable. Heavy spring rains had saturated the soil, and the old-timers warned against cutting there until the ground had time to dry out. But the company needed timber to fulfill a crucial contract, and my father was out of town, leaving me in charge of operations. Margaret waited quietly as Thomas gathered himself to continue the story that had clearly defined every moment of his life since. "I convinced myself that we could work safely if we were careful about which trees we cut and how we fell them. I selected a crew of our most experienced men and personally supervised every aspect of the operation. For 3 days, everything went perfectly. We were ahead of schedule and had encountered no problems. And on the fourth day, I made the decision to fell one last tree before moving the crew to safer ground. It was a massive pine that would have provided enough lumber to complete our contract quota. The cut went perfectly. The tree fell exactly where I intended it to fall, but the impact triggered a landslide that buried 6 men before anyone could react." Margaret felt her heart ache for the pain she could see in Thomas's eyes as he relived the catastrophe that had destroyed his former life. "You tried to save them?" "I spent 18 hours digging through mud and debris with my bare hands, even after it became clear that no one could have survived being buried under tons of earth and rock. The other workers had to physically restrain me to prevent me from triggering another slide that would have killed more people. It was an accident," Margaret said gently. "A terrible tragedy, but not a deliberate act of malice. Intent doesn't matter to the families of dead men," Thomas replied. "And it didn't matter to the territorial authorities who investigated the incident. They concluded that I had exercised poor judgment and violated basic safety protocols in pursuit of profit. No criminal charges were filed, but the civil lawsuits destroyed the company and left my father bankrupt." Margaret began to understand the full scope of the guilt and shame that had driven Thomas into his years of exile. He had not simply made a mistake. He had made a decision that cost human lives and destroyed his family's legacy in the process. "Where is your father now?" "He died 2 years ago, according to a newspaper I found in town. Heart attack brought on by stress and financial ruin. Another death that can be laid at my feet." "Thomas, you cannot blame yourself for every consequence that followed from that accident. Yes, you made a decision that had tragic results, but staying in the mountains punishing yourself doesn't bring back the men who died or restore your father's health." "No, but it ensures that I never have the opportunity to make similar mistakes. Dead men don't endanger other people through poor judgment." Margaret realized that they had reached the crux of Thomas's psychological struggle. He had convinced himself that his continued existence represented a threat to others, and only through complete isolation could he prevent further tragedies from occurring. "If that's true, then why did you agree to come down from the mountains?" Why take the risk of returning to civilization if you believe you're fundamentally dangerous? Thomas was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because you convinced me that maybe the people who died deserve to have their deaths mean something. And maybe the only way to honor them is to try to live a life that prevents similar tragedies rather than simply avoiding all risk of causing them. Margaret felt a surge of hope that Thomas was beginning to move beyond his paralyzing guilt towards something that might eventually resemble healing. But their philosophical breakthrough was about to be tested by the harsh realities of small-town politics and law enforcement. Sheriff Garrett will discover this story if he investigates thoroughly enough, Margaret said. The question is whether we tell him ourselves or wait for him to uncover it through other means. If we tell him, he'll have me back in a cage before sunset, Thomas replied. The son of a wealthy businessman who caused 6 deaths and then disappeared for 3 years isn't the kind of person small-town sheriffs want walking freely through their communities. And if we don't tell him, and he discovers the truth through his own investigation, our credibility will be completely destroyed. He'll assume we've been lying about everything, not just the details of your background. They were facing an impossible choice between certain disaster and probable disaster, with no good options available. Margaret found herself thinking about her late husband's approach to difficult decisions. David had always counseled honesty as the best policy, even when the immediate consequences seemed overwhelming. We tell him the truth, Margaret decided, all of it. And we trust that he's more interested in justice than in simply finding someone to blame. Thomas looked at her with an expression that contained equal parts admiration and concern. Miss Sullivan, you have more faith in human nature than my experience would justify. Sheriff Garrett strikes me as a man who sees the world in very simple terms, and my story doesn't fit into simple categories. Maybe not, Margaret admitted. But the alternative is to continue building our lives on a foundation of deception. And that's not sustainable in a community this small. As they walked back toward town for their appointment with Sheriff Garrett, Margaret reflected on how quickly their carefully constructed new beginning was unraveling. 3 weeks ago, Thomas had been a caged curiosity with no future beyond indefinite captivity. Today, he was a valued employee with skills and knowledge that had earned him respect from his colleagues and supervisors. Tonight he might be back in a cage, waiting for territorial authorities to decide his fate. But Margaret also realized that this crisis represented an opportunity as well as a threat. If Thomas could find the courage to face his past honestly, and if the community could find the wisdom to distinguish between tragic mistakes and criminal behavior, then perhaps both healing and justice might be possible. The sheriff's office occupied a small building on Main Street, next to the courthouse and across from the town's only bank. Margaret and Thomas arrived precisely at 2 o'clock to find Garrett waiting for them with a thick folder of papers spread across his desk and an expression that suggested he had already reached some preliminary conclusions about the matter at hand. Mr. Blackwood, Miss Sullivan, please have a seat, Garrett said with the kind of formal politeness that preceded unpleasant revelations. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me about these matters. Margaret noticed that the sheriff had positioned their chairs so that he could observe both of their faces clearly while keeping his own expression partially shadowed. It was a subtle but effective interrogation technique that immediately put them at a psychological disadvantage. I've been conducting some research into your background, Mr. Blackwood, Garrett continued, and I've discovered some very interesting information. It seems that Thomas Blackwood was once associated with Mountain View Logging Company in a management capacity. Would you care to elaborate on that association? The moment of truth had arrived sooner than expected, and Margaret realized that Garrett already knew at least part of Thomas's story. Their only option now was to control the narrative by providing complete and honest information before the sheriff could use partial knowledge to create a more damaging interpretation. Sheriff Garrett, Margaret said before Thomas could respond, We came here today prepared to provide you with full disclosure about Mr. Blackwood's background. We believe transparency serves everyone's interests better than continued speculation." Garrett raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Margaret's directness. "I'm certainly interested in hearing your version of events, Miss Sullivan. Please proceed." Thomas straightened in his chair and began to speak with the calm dignity of a man who had finally decided to stop running from his past. "My name is Thomas Blackwood, and I am the former heir to Mountain View Logging Company. 8 years ago, I made a decision that resulted in the deaths of 6 employees and the eventual bankruptcy of my family's business. I fled to the mountains rather than face the consequences of my actions, and I remained there until Miss Sullivan's intervention provided me with the opportunity to rejoin civilization." Garrett leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from suspicious interrogation to genuine surprise. Whatever he had expected to hear, a complete confession delivered with such straightforward honesty was clearly not it. "Go on," he said simply. Thomas proceeded to tell the entire story of the landslide, the investigation that followed, and his father's subsequent death from stress-related illness. He spoke without emotion but with complete accuracy, neither minimizing his responsibility nor exaggerating the tragic circumstances that had led to his exile. When Thomas finished, the office was silent except for the ticking of the clock on Garrett's wall. Margaret found herself holding her breath, waiting for the sheriff's response to determine whether their gamble on honesty would prove to have been wisdom or catastrophic miscalculation. Finally, Garrett spoke. "Mr. Blackwood, I have to say that your story is not what I expected to hear when I began this investigation. I was prepared to uncover evidence of criminal behavior or deliberate deception. Instead, I find myself listening to a man taking responsibility for a tragic accident that destroyed his life as completely as it destroyed the lives of his employees." Margaret felt a cautious flicker of hope, but she knew they were not yet clear of danger. Garrett's response suggested understanding, but understanding and acceptance were not the same thing. "The question now," Garrett continued, "is what should be done with this information. You've demonstrated remarkable honesty in providing it voluntarily, but the facts remain unchanged. 6 men died as a result of your decisions, and you spent 3 years evading any accountability for those deaths." "I wasn't evading accountability," Thomas said quietly. "I was serving a sentence I imposed on myself because I believed it was what justice required. Whether that sentence was adequate or appropriate is not for me to judge." Garrett stood and walked to the window, staring out at the street where afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen. Margaret could see him wrestling with a decision that would affect not only Thomas's fate, but also the precedent he established for how the community dealt with complex moral questions. "Miss Sullivan," Garrett said without turning around, "what is your assessment of Mr. Blackwood's current character and intentions?" Margaret realized that her answer might be the most important words she would ever speak. Everything she and Thomas had built together, everything they hoped to accomplish in the future, hung on her ability to articulate why redemption was possible, even for someone who had made terrible mistakes. "Sheriff Garrett, I believe that Thomas Blackwood is a man who has learned from his mistakes in the most profound way possible. He has lived with the consequences of his decisions every day for 8 years, and that experience has taught him the true value of human life and the weight of responsibility. He is not the same person who made that fatal error in judgment, and he deserves the opportunity to prove that people can change for the better." Garrett turned back to face them, his expression unreadable. Margaret braced herself for whatever judgment was about to be pronounced on their future. Sheriff Garrett returned to his desk and sat down heavily, the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He opened the thick folder before him and began reading through documents that Margaret realized must contain official records of the Mountain View Logging Company incident. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the rustling of papers. and the distant sounds of Pine Ridge going about its afternoon business. "I've been in correspondence with territorial authorities about this matter," Garrett said finally. "The statute of limitations on civil liability expired 2 years ago, and no criminal charges were ever filed. From a legal standpoint, Mr. Blackwood, you are free of any formal obligation to answer for what happened at Mountain View." Margaret felt a surge of relief, but Garrett's expression suggested that legal technicalities were only part of his consideration. "However," he continued, "the question of public safety remains paramount." "What would you advise, Sheriff?" Margaret asked, recognizing that Garrett's recommendation would carry significant weight in the community and beyond. Garrett leaned back in his chair and studied both of them carefully before responding. "Miss Sullivan, Mr. Blackwood, I've been a peace officer for 23 years, and I've learned to recognize the difference between people who are genuinely dangerous and people who have made tragic mistakes. Mr. Blackwood clearly falls into the collevamus latter category." He gestured toward the documents spread across his desk. "More importantly, he has demonstrated over the past 3 weeks that he is committed to making amends for his past through constructive action rather than continued self-punishment. That suggests to me that he might be exactly the person his father believed could turn a tragedy into something meaningful." Margaret felt a growing sense of possibility as she began to understand the full scope of what Garrett was suggesting. Thomas's story was not ending with redemption from his past mistakes, but beginning with an opportunity to transform those mistakes into a force for preventing future tragedies. "I would recommend," Garrett continued, "that Mr. Blackwood remain in Pine Ridge long enough to fully understand his inheritance and its implications. The foundation his father established has been operating under interim management, but it needs someone with both technical expertise and personal commitment to reach its full potential." Thomas found his voice again, though it carried a tremor of uncertainty. "Sheriff, I appreciate your confidence, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to lead an organization dedicated to preventing the kind of disaster I caused. How can someone who made such a catastrophic error in judgment be trusted to teach others about safety?" "Because," Garrett replied with surprising firmness, "someone who has never made a serious mistake has never been tested under real pressure. Your error in judgment 8 years ago was tragic, but it was also educational. You understand the consequences of poor decisions in ways that someone with a perfect safety record never could." Margaret watched Thomas grapple with this perspective. Seeing him slowly begin to accept the possibility that his painful experience might actually qualify him for the work his father had envisioned rather than disqualifying him from it. "There's one more thing you should know," Garrett said, producing the final document from his folder. "The families of the men who died in the Mountain View accident have been recipients of ongoing support from your father's foundation. I took the liberty of contacting their representatives to inform them that you had been found alive." Thomas tensed, clearly expecting to hear that the victims' families demanded justice or compensation that would consume whatever resources his father had left behind. "Their response was unanimous," Garrett continued. "They want to meet with you, not to demand accountability, but to share their memories of the men who died and to support the work your father began in their honor." Margaret saw Thomas's composure finally break as the full emotional weight of 8 years of unnecessary guilt crashed over him. Tears flowed down his weathered cheeks as he realized that the people he had thought must hate him for their losses actually wanted to work with him to ensure their loved ones had not died in vain. "They don't blame me?" Thomas asked through his tears. "They blamed the dangerous conditions that existed throughout the lumber industry," Garrett replied. "Your father's foundation has already prevented dozens of similar accidents through improved safety protocols and better training programs. The families see you not as the cause of their grief, but as someone uniquely positioned to honor their losses through continued prevention work." Margaret reached over and took Thomas's hand, feeling the calluses that marked years of hard labor and survival, but also sensing the strength that had carried him through the darkest period of his life. She realized that their journey together was entering a new phase, one that involved not just personal redemption, but the opportunity to create something larger than either of them could achieve alone. "Sheriff Garrett," Margaret said, "what would be required for Thomas to assume leadership of his father's foundation?" "Primarily a willingness to relocate to the territorial capital, where the foundation's headquarters are located," Garrett replied. "The work involves developing safety protocols, training instructors, and conducting inspections of lumber operations throughout the territory. It would mean leaving Pine Ridge, but it would also mean taking on work that could save hundreds of lives over the coming years." Thomas wiped his eyes and straightened in his chair, and Margaret could see him beginning to transform before her eyes from a man haunted by his past into someone energized by the possibility of meaningful future. "Work. Miss Sullivan," Thomas said, turning to face her directly, "you gave me back my life when you purchased my freedom from that cage. I can never repay that debt, but I can offer you the opportunity to be part of something that might justify the faith you showed in me." Margaret felt her heart race as she realized what Thomas was suggesting. He was asking her to join him not just in leaving Pine Ridge, but in dedicating their lives to work that honored the memory of the men who had died while preventing similar tragedies from occurring. "Are you offering me employment with the foundation?" Margaret asked. "I'm offering you a partnership," Thomas replied. "The foundation needs someone with administrative skills and the ability to work with families who have lost loved ones in industrial accidents. Your experience in helping me transition back to civilization suggests you have exactly the qualities needed for that work." Margaret thought about her small room above Patterson's general store, her job counting inventory and waiting on customers, and the quiet desperation that had marked her days since David's death. The work Thomas was describing would be challenging and meaningful, but it would also mean leaving behind the safe predictability she had built for herself in Pine Ridge. "What about the town council's supervision requirements?" Margaret asked. "We still have a week remaining on the probationary period." Garrett smiled for the first time since their conversation had begun. "Miss Sullivan, I think it's safe to say that, Mr. Pine Ridge is a small community that depends on trust and stability. The presence of someone with your history, regardless of legal status, creates complications that extend beyond simple law enforcement." Thomas leaned forward slightly, his massive frame tense with anticipation. "Sheriff, I understand your concerns about public safety. If my presence in Pine Ridge creates problems for the community, I'm prepared to leave immediately. I never intended to bring trouble to people who have shown me kindness." "That's the interesting thing, Mr. Blackwood," Garrett replied. "In the 3 weeks since your release, there have been 0 incidents involving you. No complaints, no disturbances, no evidence of any behavior that would justify continued concern about your character. In fact, quite the opposite." Garrett pulled out a separate sheet of paper covered with his own handwriting. "I've spoken with Robert Chun, Mrs. Miller at the boarding house, and several other business owners who have had contact with you. Consensus is remarkably consistent. You are polite, hardworking, reliable, and demonstrably committed to earning an honest living." Margaret exchanged a glance with Thomas, seeing her own cautious hope reflected in his eyes. They had expected judgment and condemnation, but Garrett seemed to be building toward a different kind of conclusion. "More significantly," Garrett continued, "I've received a telegram from the territorial capital that sheds additional light on your situation. It seems that your disappearance 8 years ago generated considerable search efforts, not because authorities suspected you of criminal activity, but because your family was concerned for your welfare." He handed Margaret a yellow telegraph form that she read with growing amazement. The message was from the Territorial Records Office, confirming that Thomas Blackwood had been declared legally dead after 3 years of unsuccessful search efforts. His father had spent thousands of dollars on private investigators and search parties, driven by the belief that his son had committed suicide in the wilderness rather than live with the guilt of the logging accident. "Your father never stopped looking for you," Garrett said quietly. According to this correspondence, he blamed himself for placing too much responsibility on your shoulders too early in your career. He believed that the pressure he had put on you to prove yourself worthy of inheriting the company had led directly to the poor decision that caused the accident. Thomas stared at the telegraph form as if it contained words in a foreign language. He blamed himself? The records indicate that he spent his remaining years trying to locate you and attempting to rebuild the company not for profit, but to create a memorial fund for the families of the men who died. The bankruptcy occurred because he invested every available resource in search efforts and victim compensation rather than business operations. Margaret watched Thomas absorb this information, seeing the profound impact it was having on his understanding of the past 8 years. He had fled into the mountains believing himself to be a pariah who had destroyed his family's legacy through selfish ambition. Instead, he was learning that his father had seen the accident as a shared responsibility and had dedicated his remaining life to honoring the victims. "There's more," Garrett said, producing another document from his folder. "Your father's will, filed with the Territorial Probate Court, leaves instructions that if you were ever found alive, you were to inherit not only his remaining personal property but also a responsibility he considered more important than wealth." Thomas looked up from the telegraph form with eyes that seemed to be seeing the world from an entirely new perspective. "What kind of responsibility?" He established a foundation dedicated to improving safety standards in the lumber industry. New protocols for evaluating dangerous cutting conditions, better training for foremen and crew leaders, equipment innovations designed to prevent the kind of accident that occurred at Mountain View. He wanted you to oversee its implementation if you ever returned. Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes as she realized the profound irony of the situation. Thomas had spent 8 years punishing himself for mistakes that his father had seen as learning opportunities. The very tragedy that had driven Thomas into exile had motivated his father to create something that might prevent similar disasters in the future. "He believed you were the only person qualified to lead this work," Garrett continued, "because you were the only person who truly understood both the technical aspects of lumber operations and the human cost of safety." "Failures," Thomas sat in stunned silence, staring at documents that revealed a father's love and faith that had persisted even through years of uncertainty and grief. Margaret could see him struggling to reconcile this new information with the narrative of shame and abandonment that had defined his exile. "Sheriff Garrett," Thomas said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't understand. If my father felt this way, if he was working to honor the men who died, why did no one ever tell me? Why did I spend all those years believing I had destroyed everything he had built?" "Because you disappeared before anyone could tell you," Garrett replied gently. "Your father tried to reach you immediately after the accident, but you had already fled to the mountains. The search parties never found any trace of your presence in the wilderness areas where you were actually living." Margaret realized that Thomas's survival skills, the same abilities that had kept him alive during years of solitude, had also prevented him from being found by people who wanted to help rather than harm him. His expertise in avoiding detection had trapped him in an isolation that was as much psychological as physical. "The question now," Garrett said, shifting back to his official demeanor, "is what we do with this information. Legally, you are free to go wherever you choose and pursue whatever life you see fit to build. Practically, you have inherited both resources and responsibilities that could make a significant difference in preventing future tragedies." Thomas looked at Margaret with an expression that sought guidance for a decision he was not prepared to make alone. She could see him wrestling with the possibility that his years of exile might have been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of his father's response to the tragedy. Blackwood has successfully demonstrated his ability to function as a productive member of society. I'll recommend to the council that the probationary period be ended immediately, and that his guardianship status be converted to full independence. Thomas looked back and forth between Margaret and Garrett, and she could see him hardly daring to believe that the nightmare of the past 8 years was actually ending with an opportunity for redemption rather than continued punishment. "There is one condition I would like to attach to this arrangement," Garrett added. "I want regular reports on the Foundation's activities and their impact on safety in the lumber industry. Pine Ridge is a lumber town, and we have a vested interest in seeing that the work your father began continues to protect our workers." "You'll have those reports," Thomas promised. "And more than that, Pine Ridge will be one of the first communities to benefit from the new safety protocols and training programs. I owe this town a debt that can only be repaid through ensuring that its workers never face the kind of dangers that killed those men at Mountain View." Margaret realized that they had reached a moment of decision that would determine not just their immediate future, but the entire trajectory of their lives. She could remain safely in Pine Ridge, continuing her quiet existence and avoiding the risks that came with ambitious undertakings, or she could trust in the possibility that broken people could indeed build something beautiful from the fragments of their damaged lives. "When would we need to leave for the territorial capital?" Margaret asked. Thomas's face lit up with hope and gratitude. "As soon as we can arrange transportation and pack our belongings. The Foundation has been operating without proper leadership for too long, and every day we delay represents potential tragedies that might be prevented with better guidance." Margaret thought about her wedding ring, the symbol of her connection to David that she had traded for Thomas's freedom. At the time, it had seemed like an ending, the final sacrifice of her past life for an uncertain gamble on redemption. But now she realized it had actually been a beginning, the first investment in a partnership that might honor David's memory through work that saved other families from the grief she had experienced. "Sheriff Garrett," Margaret said with growing confidence, "I accept Mr. Blackwood's offer to join him in leading his father's foundation. I believe this work represents the best possible use of the second chance you've given us." Garrett stood and extended his hand to both of them in turn. "Then I wish you both success in your new endeavors. Pine Ridge will miss your contributions, but the territory will benefit immeasurably from your leadership." As they left the sheriff's office, Margaret felt the same sense of purposeful excitement that had marked the best days of her marriage to David. She was embarking on work that mattered, with a partner who understood both the weight of responsibility and the possibility of redemption. Thomas walked beside her with a lightness in his step that had been absent since his release from the cage. For the first time in 8 years, he was moving toward something meaningful rather than simply away from unbearable guilt. "Margaret," Thomas said as they paused in the town square where his cage had once stood, "I want you to know that whatever happens in our future work together, you've already given me the greatest gift possible. You saw something in me that I had stopped believing existed, and you were willing to risk everything to help me find it again." Margaret looked at the empty platform where Thomas had spent 3 years on display as Pine Ridge's captive curiosity, then at the man who now stood free beside her, ready to dedicate his life to preventing others from experiencing the tragedies that had shaped both their lives. "Thomas," she replied, "I think we've given each other exactly what we needed. You needed someone to believe in your capacity for redemption, and I needed someone to remind me that broken things can be repaired if we're willing to do the work." As evening shadows began to lengthen across Pine Ridge, 2 people who had found each other through a combination of desperation and hope prepared to leave behind the small mountain town that had brought them together. Their destination was the territorial capital, where the real work of their partnership would begin. But their journey toward healing and purpose had already transformed them, both in ways that would last for the rest of their lives. The cage that had once contained Thomas Blackwood stood empty now, a reminder not of captivity and despair, but of the possibility that even the most broken people could find their way back to lives of meaning and contribution. And somewhere, in the mountain wind that whispered through Pine Ridge that night, the spirits of 6 men who had died in a logging accident 8 years earlier might have found peace in knowing that their deaths would not be forgotten, and that their memory would live on in work dedicated to protecting others from similar fates. 5 years later, Margaret stood before the gleaming bronze plaque mounted outside the territorial headquarters of the Blackwood Safety Foundation. The inscription read simply, "In memory of 6 brave men whose sacrifice illuminated the path towards safer working conditions for all." Below their names, a second line honored David Sullivan, whose widow had helped transform personal tragedy into public service. The foundation had grown beyond anything Thomas's father could have imagined. What began as a modest fund to support victims' families had evolved into the territory's premier organization for industrial safety research and training. Lumber operations throughout the region now followed protocols developed by Thomas and his team, protocols that had prevented countless accidents and saved dozens of lives. Margaret adjusted the simple gold band on her finger, a replacement for the wedding ring she had once traded for a man's freedom. Thomas had insisted on purchasing it himself when they married 2 years earlier, calling it a symbol of new beginnings, built on the foundation of old love. Their ceremony had been attended by the families of the Mountain View victims, who had become not just supporters but active participants in the foundation's work. "Mrs. Blackwood?" a young voice interrupted her thoughts. Margaret turned to see Samuel Peterson, the newest member of their safety inspection team. At 19, he was the son of one of the men who had died in the original accident, and his dedication to preventing similar tragedies burned with the intensity of personal mission. "The crews are ready for the morning inspection at Cedar Ridge," Samuel reported. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to tell you that he'll meet us there directly from the training facility." Margaret nodded, gathering the inspection reports that would guide their evaluation of the logging operation. Cedar Ridge represented exactly the kind of challenging terrain that had once claimed lives through inadequate safety measures. Today, it operated under strict protocols that ensured no worker faced unnecessary danger. The ride to Cedar Ridge took them through mountain country that reminded Margaret of her first journey with Thomas from Pine Ridge to the territorial capital. Then, they had been fleeing toward an uncertain future. Now they were traveling toward work that honored the past while protecting the future. At the logging site, Margaret found Thomas conferring with the operation foreman about soil conditions and weather, factors that might affect the day's cutting schedule. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had earned respect through expertise and dedication rather than demanding it through position or wealth. "Ground moisture levels are acceptable," Thomas was saying as Margaret approached, "but keep monitoring the slope stability throughout the morning. If conditions change, shut down operations immediately." The foreman nodded respectfully. Thomas's reputation in the lumber industry was legendary, not just for his technical knowledge but for his unwavering commitment to worker safety. Men who had initially resented the new regulations now sought his approval as a badge of honor, understanding that his standards came from genuine concern for their welfare. "Everything looks good here," Thomas said to Margaret as the work crews dispersed to their assigned areas. "The training program is working exactly as we hoped. These men understand that safety isn't about following rules, it's about protecting each other." Margaret watched the crews begin their work with practiced efficiency, each movement guided by protocols that had been written in the blood of previous tragedies, but implemented with hope for a safer future. The sight filled her with the same sense of purpose that had driven her to purchase Thomas's freedom with her wedding ring. "Any word from Pine Ridge?" Thomas asked as they prepared to return to the capital. "Sheriff Garrett sends his regards," Margaret replied, pulling out a letter that had arrived that morning. "The new safety inspector we trained is working out well, and they've had no serious accidents in over 18 months. Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features with genuine warmth. The haunted look that had marked his early days of freedom had been replaced by the calm confidence of a man who had found his calling. He still carried the scars of his past, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of the price of complacency and the value of vigilance. As their carriage rolled back toward the territorial capital, Margaret reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment. She had begun as a grieving widow seeking purpose in helping a caged stranger. He had been a broken man convinced that his existence threatened others. Together, they had built something that honored both their losses and their hopes. The foundation's success had attracted attention from across the territory and beyond. Other industries were adopting their safety models, and their training programs were being replicated in mining operations, construction projects, and manufacturing facilities. What had started as an effort to prevent logging accidents had grown into a movement that protected workers in every dangerous profession. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Giving up your quiet life in Pine Ridge for all this responsibility?" Margaret considered the question seriously. Their work was demanding and often heartbreaking, involving investigations of accidents that had already claimed lives and efforts to prevent tragedies that might never occur. But it was also deeply meaningful, connecting them to something larger than their individual struggles with loss and guilt. "Never," she said finally. "This work honors David's memory better than any monument could. He believed in second chances and the power of love to heal broken things. Everything we've built together proves he was right." Thomas reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become their silent affirmation of partnership in both work and life. They had found their way from isolation and despair to purpose and connection, proving that even the most damaged people could create something beautiful if they were willing to trust in the possibility of redemption. As the sun set behind the mountains that had once hidden Thomas from the world, Margaret thought about the wedding ring that had started their journey together. She had traded a symbol of her past for a stranger's freedom, never imagining that the exchange would lead to a love deeper than anything she had previously known and work more meaningful than anything she had dared to dream. The territorial capital came into view as darkness fell, its lights twinkling like stars across the valley floor. Somewhere in those lights was the Foundation headquarters, where tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to transform tragedy into hope. And somewhere in the mountains beyond, the spirits of men who had died too young might rest easier knowing that their sacrifice had not been forgotten, and that their memory lived on in work dedicated to protecting others from similar fates. Thomas and Margaret Blackwood rode toward home together, no longer defined by the cages that had once contained them, but liberated by the love that had set them free and the purpose that now guided their days. Their story had begun with fear and isolation, but it ended with hope and the knowledge that broken people could indeed build something beautiful from the fragments of their damaged lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.